He thought he was bidding for land, but is he ready to confront the men who came to erase a valley? The stage from Denver wheezed to a halt outside Millfield's single hotel as the courthouse bell chimed 7 times. Samuel Hartwell swung down from the dusty coach, his leather satchel heavy with the last of his railroad wages and a yellowed postcard that had brought him 400 miles home. The mountains pressed close against the valley here, their peaks still white with October snow, and the air tasted of coming winter. "Auction starts at 9, called the driver, already unhitching the team. "If you're here for the Brennan place," Samuel nodded, though the postcard in his pocket had mentioned more than just one homestead going under the hammer. His brother Tom's handwriting, shaky from the lung fever that had taken him 2 months back, had spelled out the truth. "Half the valley's up for sale. Banks calling in everything. Come quick, they're selling everything." The hotel keeper, a rail-thin man with ink-stained fingers, looked up from his guest register. "Hartwell," he said, reading the name Samuel wrote. "Any relation to Tom Hartwell?" "His brother. Sorry for your loss." Tom was good people. The keeper's voice dropped. "Lot of good people losing their places tomorrow. Bank's been tightening the rope all summer." Samuel climbed the narrow stairs to a room that smelled of old tobacco and loneliness. Through the single window, he could see the courthouse square, where men were already setting up tables and a wooden platform. The auction block sat in the center like an altar, waiting for its sacrifices. He pulled out the postcard again, studying the faded image of Pike's Peak on the front. On the back, below Tom's urgent message, someone else had added a line in different ink. "CD can help. Find her at the auction." The handwriting was careful, feminine. 8 o'clock chimed, and Samuel made his way downstairs. The hotel's dining room buzzed with conversation ranchers nursing black coffee, their faces grim as undertakers. At a corner table, a young woman sat alone, a leather-bound ledger open before her. She wore a simple blue dress, her dark hair pinned severely back, but her eyes held the kind of intelligence that cut through pretense, like a blade through cloth. Their gazes met across the room, and Samuel felt something shift, not quite recognition, but its promise. "Miss Donovan?" he asked, approaching her table. She looked up, her pen hovering over columns of figures. "You're Tom Hartwell's brother." "I can see the resemblance." "Samuel." He gestured to the empty chair. "May I?" Clara Donovan nodded, closing the ledger with a soft thud. "Your brother was a good man. He tried to help folks understand what was coming. The foreclosures? More than that." She glanced around the dining room, then leaned forward. "Someone's been buying up the bank's paper. Not just taking what comes to auction, purchasing the debts beforehand, at discount. Whoever it is has been bleeding the valley dry on purpose." The courthouse bell tolled 9 times, its bronze voice carrying across the square. Through the window, Samuel could see the crowd gathering, families clutching their few remaining possessions, speculators with fat wallets and cold eyes. Clara stood, tucking the ledger under her arm. "If you want to know who's really behind this, stay close during the auction. Sometimes the hunter reveals himself when he thinks the prey is cornered." They walked together toward the courthouse, joining the stream of people flowing into the square. The auctioneer, a florid man with a voice like a carnival barker, had already begun his preliminary announcements. Behind him, Sheriff Donovan stood with arms folded, his badge catching the morning sun like a warning. "First lot," the auctioneer called, "the Henderson place. 40 acres of good bottomland, plus improvements. Do I hear $50? An elderly woman in a threadbare shawl raised her hand. "That's my home," she whispered to the man beside her. 40 years I've worked that land." A voice from the back of the crowd called out. 75. Samuel turned to see who had bid, but the speaker was hidden in the press of bodies. Clara touched his arm, nodding toward a man in an expensive suit who stood apart from the main crowd, making notes in a small book. "James Morrison," she murmured, "Denver lawyer. He's been at every auction this summer, but he never bids himself." The bidding climbed quickly, far beyond what any family could afford. When the hammer fell at $130, the old woman began to weep quietly. Next lot, the Kowalski farm and mill operation. Samuel's attention sharpened. The mill that ground grain for half the valley, the wheel that had stopped turning for the first time in 30 years. The Kowalski family stood together near the platform, 3 generations watching their inheritance disappear. Opening bid $200. This time, Samuel spotted the bidder immediately, a lean man with silver hair and a watch chain that caught the light. He bid with subtle nods, driving the price higher and higher, while the Kowalskis' faces grew more desperate. $500, the silver-haired man said clearly, his voice carrying over the crowd. A gasp ran through the square. $500 was more money than most families saw in 2 years. 500 going once. 600. The voice came from directly behind Samuel, quiet but firm. He turned to see Clara Donovan, her face pale but determined, holding up her hand. The silver-haired man's eyes narrowed. He studied Clara for a long moment, then smiled coldly. 700. 800. Clara replied without hesitation. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The auctioneer's hammer hovered, waiting. $1,000, the silver-haired man said, his voice cutting through the morning air like ice. Clara's hand fell to her side. The number hung in the square like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sold to Mr. Garrett for $1,000. The Kowalski family walked away without speaking, their shoulders bent under an invisible weight. As they passed, old Stefan Kowalski pressed something small into Clara's hand, a brass key. The mill books, he whispered. Hidden room upstairs. Someone should know the truth. Clara nodded, slipping the key into her pocket. The auction continued, lot after lot falling to anonymous bidders or their representatives, the prices climbing beyond reason. With each sale, more families gathered their belongings and walked away from lives they'd spent decades building. Final lot of the morning, the auctioneer announced. The Brennan homestead, 80 acres, house and barn, creek frontage. Samuel's throat tightened. Tom's place. The land their grandfather had claimed fresh from the survey, where he'd learned to ride and rope and read the weather in the shape of clouds. Opening bid $100. Samuel raised his hand. Around him, other voices joined the bidding. But he kept his focus on the auctioneer, matching each increase with grim determination. The satchel under his arm held $340 every cent he'd saved from 2 years laying track in the Colorado mountains. 275. Samuel nodded, his pulse hammering. 3 more bids, and he'd be done. 300. He raised his hand again, aware that Clara was watching him intently. 325. This time Samuel hesitated. The bid had come from the silver-haired man, Garrett, who was studying him with the same cold calculation he'd shown the Kowalskis. Do I hear 350? The auctioneer called. Samuel's hand trembled as he raised it. $15 remained in his satchel, not enough for another round. $400, Garrett said calmly. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He watched helplessly as the auctioneer's hammer rose. 400 going once, 450. Clara's voice rang clear across the square. Every head turned toward her. Garrett's eyes narrowed to slits. 500, he counted. 600. Clara replied immediately. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the auctioneer seemed stunned by the rapid escalation. Garrett studied Clara for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his watch chain. Finally, he shook his head and stepped back into the crowd. Sold to Miss Donovan for $600. The square erupted in surprised chatter. Clara moved toward the clerk's table, pulling a bank draft from her reticule with hands that barely trembled. Samuel caught up with her as she signed the papers. Why? He asked. She looked up from the deed, her eyes unreadable. Because someone needs to find out what's really happening here. And Tom's brother seemed like the right person to help. The courthouse clock chimed noon as the morning's auction concluded. Families scattered like leaves before winter wind, some heading for the stage depot with their remaining possessions, others gathering in small groups to share their grief and anger. Clara handed Samuel the deed to his family's land. Partnership, she said. Your knowledge of the valley, my resources. We find out who's behind this, and we stop them. Samuel studied the document, his brother's land restored to family hands through the kindness of a stranger. What makes you think it can be stopped? Clara touched the brass key in her pocket, because men who work in shadows usually have something to hide, and hidden things have a way of coming to light. The afternoon sun slanted low through the windows of the abandoned mill, painting long rectangles of gold across the dusty floor. Clara and Samuel climbed the narrow stairs to the second story, following Stefan Kowalski's whispered directions. Behind a stack of grain sacks, Clara's key turned easily in a small door neither of them would have noticed otherwise. The hidden room was tiny, barely large enough for a desk and chair, but every inch of wall space was covered with papers, maps, and photographs. Stefan Kowalski's secret archive of the Valley's business contracts, correspondence, and a detailed map showing every property that had been foreclosed in the past year. "Look at this," Clara said, spreading the map across the desk. Red ink marked each lost farm and ranch, creating a pattern that snaked along Willow Creek from its headwaters in the mountains down to where it joined the Arkansas River. Samuel traced the red marks with his finger. "It's not random. Someone's been targeting specific properties." Clara pulled down a folder marked Denver and Rio Grande survey notes. Inside, official railroad documents detailed a proposed spur line that would follow Willow Creek's path exactly, connecting the main line to rich mineral deposits in the high country. "Copper," Samuel read aloud. "Estimated value of ore deposits, $2 million. And every foreclosed property sits right in the railroad's path." Clara's voice was tight with anger. "They've been driving families off their land to clear the way for a railroad spur. All those people losing their homes so someone in Denver can get rich." A board creaked downstairs. Samuel held up his hand for silence, listening. Footsteps crossed the mill's main floor, too heavy and deliberate to be settling timber. Clara quickly folded the map and stuffed it into her dress. Samuel gathered the most important documents, while she replaced the others, trying to leave the room looking undisturbed. The footsteps climbed the stairs. Samuel eased the hidden door shut and turned the key just as Boots appeared on the stairway. Sheriff Donovan's head emerged next, his eyes scanning the room suspiciously. "Miss Donovan." "Mr. Hartwell." The sheriff's hand rested on his gun butt. "Funny place for an afternoon stroll. I wanted to see the mill before the new owner changes everything," Clara said smoothly. "My father's bank held the mortgage, after all." Donovan's gaze moved between them, lingering on the grain sacks that concealed the hidden door. "Mill's been sold. New owner wants it cleared out and locked up tight. No more visitors." "Of course," Clara replied. "We were just leaving." They walked down the stairs together, Donovan following close enough that Samuel could smell the whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. Outside, the sheriff mounted his horse and sat watching until they reached the main road. "He knows," Samuel said once they were out of earshot, "or suspects. Either way, we can't go back there." Clara pulled the folded map from her dress. "But we don't need to. This tells us everything." They walked toward town as the sun touched the mountain peaks, painting them red as blood. Clara explained what her father's ledgers had shown her, a pattern of debt purchases that had started 6 months ago, always through intermediaries. Always at prices that guaranteed foreclosure. "Garrett's just the front man," she said. "Someone with real money is behind this. Someone who knew about the railroad survey before it became public. Your father would have records of the debt sales." Clara's step faltered slightly. "My father is the president of Millfield Bank. He's also the man who's been selling the paper to whoever's behind this." Samuel stopped walking. "Your own father? He says it's just business. Clean up the bank's bad debts, let someone else take the risk." Clara's voice carried a bitter edge. "He doesn't seem to care what happens to the families involved." They reached the hotel as the dinner bell rang. In the dining room, conversations hummed around tables filled with the day's winners and losers. The silver-haired man Garrett sat alone at a corner table, cutting his steak with surgical precision. Clara touched Samuel's arm. "I need to get home before my father starts asking questions. Meet me at the church tomorrow after first service. We'll figure out our next move." Samuel nodded, watching her leave. Through the window, he could see Garrett's reflection in the glass, the man's eyes following Clara's departure with obvious interest. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with clouds pressing low against the mountain peaks. Samuel arrived at the white clapboard church as the congregation filed out, families in their Sunday best, discussing the weather and the previous day's auction in hushed tones. Clara waited by the small cemetery behind the church, her breath visible in the chilly air. She wore a dark coat buttoned to her throat, and her face looked pale in the overcast light. "My father and Garrett had breakfast together this morning," she said without preamble. "I heard them talking through the dining room door." "What did they say?" "Garrett wants to accelerate the timeline. He's planning to file railroad incorporation papers next week, before anyone else can piece together what's happening." Clara's hands twisted together. They know someone's been asking questions. A church bell tolled the half-hour, its bronze voice carrying across the valley. In the distance, Samuel could see smoke rising from several chimneys, families making Sunday dinner in homes they still owned, unaware of how precarious their situations had become. "There's something else," Clara said. "Garrett mentioned a name, Marcus Wyndham. From what I could gather, he's the real money behind this operation." Samuel frowned. "Wyndham. I've heard that name before." Memory stirred conversations around bunkhouse fires during his railroad days. He owns half the mining claims between Denver and Grand Junction. If he's planning a spur line to connect them, he'll control every ton of ore that comes out of these mountains. Clara pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket. "I found this in my father's study last night. A telegram from Denver." Samuel read the message aloud. "Acquire remaining creek properties by month's end. Opposition noted. Handle appropriately. M.W." "Handle appropriately," Clara repeated. "That doesn't sound like a business discussion." A twig snapped in the trees behind them. Samuel spun around, his hand moving instinctively toward the spot where he used to carry a sidearm during his railroad days, but the forest remained still, only the whisper of wind through bare branches. "We should go," Clara said. "Being seen together too often will only raise more questions." They walked back toward town separately, Clara taking the main road, while Samuel cut through the timber to approach from a different direction. As he emerged from the trees, he spotted two riders coming down the mountain trail, men he didn't recognize, their coats dusty with travel and their eyes scanning the valley below with the systematic attention of predators. That evening, Samuel sat in his hotel room reading the papers Clara had taken from the mill, trying to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy. The railroad survey was detailed and professional, marking not just the proposed route but also potential station sites, water sources, and ore loading facilities. Someone had invested serious money in planning this operation. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Samuel opened it to find Clara standing in the hallway, her face tight with worry. "They arrested Stefan Kowalski an hour ago," she said, stepping quickly into the room. "Sheriff Donovan claims he was trespassing at the mill." Samuel closed the door behind her. "He gave you that key yesterday. Someone must have seen him, or someone's trying to send a message." Clara moved to the window, peering down at the street below. "There's more. I overheard my father talking to Garrett again. They're planning to foreclose on 3 more properties this week, including the Hernandez ranch. Maria Hernandez has 6 children. Her husband died in a mining accident last spring. Garrett doesn't care about widows and children. He only cares about clearing the railroad route." Clara turned from the window, her eyes bright with determination. "We have to stop this, Samuel. Not just for the families they've already destroyed, but for the ones they're planning to destroy next." Samuel studied the map spread across his small table, marking the properties that would be needed to complete the railroad connection. "If we could prove the connection between Wyndham and the foreclosures, show that it's all been planned. The territorial governor would have to investigate," Clara finished. "But we'd need more than just survey maps and telegrams. We'd need documents showing the conspiracy directly. Or witnesses." Clara shook her head. "Anyone who cooperates with us risks losing everything they have left. These people are scared, Samuel. They've seen what happens to anyone who stands up to the bank." A commotion in the street below drew their attention. Through the window, they could see torches moving toward the jail, a crowd of men walking with the measured pace of a mob seeking justice. "Stefan's friends," Clara whispered. "They're going to try to break him out." Samuel grabbed his coat. "That's exactly what Garrett wants, an excuse to bring in outside help, maybe even territorial marshals." Once he has official backing, they hurried downstairs and out into the street. The crowd had gathered in front of the jail, perhaps 20 men holding torches and speaking in low, angry voices. At the center stood Peter Kowalski, Stefan's eldest son, his face hard as granite. "My father never hurt anyone in his life," Peter was saying. "He's sitting in there because he knows too much about what's been happening to this valley. And what do you propose to do about it?" Sheriff Donovan had emerged from his office, his hand resting on his gun butt. Behind him, 3 deputies flanked the jail's entrance. "We want him released," Peter replied. "Tonight, can't do that. He'll get a fair trial, same as anyone." A voice from the crowd called out, "Fair trial from whose judge? The one who's been signing all those foreclosure orders?" The tension in the torchlight thickened as more men pressed in. Clara stepped forward, moving through the crowd toward Peter Kowalski. "Peter," she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying over the angry murmurs. "This isn't the way." "Miss Donovan." Peter's voice held respect, but also pain. "They took our mill. Now they've taken my father. What's left to lose?" "Your family. Your freedom." Clara looked around the circle of faces, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "If you do this, you give them exactly the excuse they need to bring in outside force. Territorial marshals. Maybe even federal troops. Is that what you want for your wives and children?" An older man near the back of the crowd spoke up. "What do you suggest, miss? That we just let them steal everything we've worked for?" Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out the folded survey map. "I suggest we fight them with their own weapons. Facts. Evidence. The law." She unfolded the map, holding it so the torchlight illuminated the red marks showing foreclosed properties. "This is what they're really after. Not your debts, not your mistakes. A railroad line to carry ore from the high country. Every property they've taken sits directly in the path of their planned route." Murmurs of understanding rippled through the crowd as men recognized their own lost homes marked in red ink. "You have proof of this?" Peter asked. "Survey documents, correspondence, even a telegram from the man behind it all." Clara refolded the map carefully. "But we need more. We need witnesses willing to testify, records they can't deny." Sheriff Donovan had been listening from the jail steps, his face unreadable in the flickering light. Now he spoke. "You're making serious accusations, Miss Donovan. Conspiracy, fraud, those are federal crimes." "Yes, they are." Clara met his gaze steadily. "The question is whether you're going to uphold the law or protect the criminals." For a long moment, the street was silent except for the whisper of wind and the crackle of torches. Then Donovan nodded slowly. "I'll make you a deal," he said to the crowd. "Give me 48 hours. If Miss Donovan can provide real evidence of wrongdoing, I'll wire the territorial governor myself. But if you try to break my jail tonight, I'll have every man here in chains by morning." Peter Kowalski looked around the circle of faces, seeing doubt and hope warring in their expressions. Finally, he nodded. 48 hours. The crowd dispersed gradually, men walking back to their homes and boarding houses with the slow, reluctant pace of people who've been denied the satisfaction of immediate action. Samuel and Clara found themselves alone on the main street, watching the last torches disappear around corners. 48 hours, Samuel said. "Think we can do it?" Clara looked up at the hotel windows where lamplight still glowed, knowing that behind one of those windows her father was probably meeting with Garrett, planning their next move. "We have to." The next morning brought news that changed everything. Samuel was finishing his breakfast when Clara burst into the hotel dining room, her face flushed with excitement and fear. "They've moved up the timeline," she said, sitting down at his table without regard for propriety. "My father received a telegram at dawn. The railroad incorporation papers are being filed today in Denver." Samuel set down his coffee cup. "Today? But you said they planned to wait until something spooked them. Maybe last night's confrontation. Maybe just paranoia." Clara pulled a piece of paper from her reticule. "But there's more. I managed to copy this from my father's desk, a list of properties to be foreclosed this week." Samuel scanned the names, his stomach tightening. The Hernandez Ranch was there, along with 5 other families he knew personally. They're accelerating everything. Because they know we're onto them. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. Samuel, there's something else. I overheard Garrett talking to those two men who rode in yesterday. He used the phrase, permanent solutions for permanent problems. The implication sent a chill down Samuel's spine. We need to get word to the territorial governor immediately. With what? Survey maps and a copy of a telegram? Clara shook her head. We need the original documents, something that directly connects Wyndham to the fraudulent foreclosures. Samuel thought for a moment, then stood up abruptly. The bank. Your father's office there has to be correspondence, contracts, something that shows the real arrangement. I can't just walk into his office and demand to see private business documents. But you know the building. You know his habits. Samuel leaned forward. Tonight, after the bank closes, we go in, find what we need, and get out. Clara stared at him. You're talking about breaking into my father's bank. I'm talking about saving this valley from a conspiracy that's already destroyed dozens of families. Samuel's voice hardened. If your father was an innocent party, those documents would prove it. If he's not. Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. When she looked up, her eyes held a resolve that hadn't been there before. There's a rear entrance he uses for private meetings. I have a key. They spent the day making careful preparations. Samuel visited several of the threatened families, warning them quietly about the accelerated foreclosures without revealing too much about their investigation. Clara used her position as the banker's daughter to observe the comings and goings at the bank, noting when the building emptied and which windows showed light after hours. As evening approached, clouds gathered over the mountains, promising another cold night. Samuel met Clara behind the church, both of them dressed in dark clothes that would blend with shadows. Garrett's staying late at the bank tonight, Clara reported. I saw him go in around 5 o'clock, but he hasn't come out. Change of plans, then. We wait until he leaves. They took positions in the alley behind the bank building, watching the rear entrance Clara had mentioned. Hours passed. The church clock chimed 8, then 9, then 10. Finally, the back door opened and Garrett emerged, carrying a leather portfolio under his arm. Samuel and Clara waited until his footsteps faded, then approached the door. Clara's key turned smoothly in the lock, and they slipped inside. The bank's interior was darker than Samuel had expected, with only faint moonlight filtering through the front windows. Clara led the way through the main banking floor to a private office in the rear, her movements confident despite the darkness. My father's desk, she whispered, pointing to a large wooden piece that dominated the small room. If there's correspondence with Wyndham, it would be there. Samuel struck a match, cupping the flame carefully as Clara opened desk drawers. The first drawers held only routine banking papers. The third drawer was locked. Here. Clara pulled a hairpin from her head, bending it into a makeshift lockpick. Tom taught me this when we were children. The lock clicked open, revealing a cache of documents that made both of them catch their breath. Letters from Marcus Wyndham detailed the entire conspiracy property acquisition targets, timeline for foreclosures, even instructions for dealing with local resistance. Samuel read one letter aloud in a whisper. Per our agreement, all Creek properties must be acquired by November 1st. Railroad incorporation filing will proceed as scheduled. Recommend expediting final foreclosures to avoid territorial investigation. Here's the financial arrangement, Clara said, holding up a contract. Wyndham's paying my father a percentage of the final property value, not just the debt amount. He's been profiting from every family's misery. A board creaked in the front of the building. Samuel blew out the match, plunging them into darkness. Footsteps crossed the main banking floor, moving toward the rear office. Samuel grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her toward a side door that led to a storage room. They slipped inside just as light appeared in the office doorway. Through a crack in the storage room door, Samuel could see Garrett's silhouette, lamp in one hand and gun in the other. The man moved systematically through the office, checking drawers and examining papers. I know someone's been here, Garrett said to the darkness. Documents. Don't rearrange themselves. Clara pressed against Samuel in the narrow storage space, both of them barely breathing. In her hand, she still clutched the contract that proved her father's guilt. Garrett spent another 10 minutes searching the office, then moved back toward the front of the bank. Samuel and Clara waited until they heard the front door close before emerging from hiding. "We have to go," Samuel whispered. "Now, before he comes back with help." They slipped out the rear entrance, locking the door behind them. In the alley, Clara leaned against the wall, her breath coming in short gasps. "My father," she said quietly. "He's really part of this." Samuel folded the stolen documents carefully. "These letters prove everything: the conspiracy, the fraud, the planned railroad. With this evidence, the territorial governor will have to act, if we can get it to him before Garrett and my father realize what's missing." They hurried through the dark streets toward the hotel, keeping to shadows and avoiding the main thoroughfares. Behind them, the bank building sat silent and dark, holding its secrets for a few more hours. In Samuel's hotel room, they spread the documents across the small table, cataloging their discovery. Letters, contracts, maps, and financial records painted a picture of systematic fraud that had been months in the planning. "We need to get these to the territorial capital immediately," Samuel said. "The morning stage can carry them to the telegraph office in Colorado Springs." Clara nodded, then froze as boots clattered on the hotel stairs outside. Heavy footsteps, moving with purpose. A fist hammered on the door. "Open up! Sheriff's business!" Samuel quickly gathered the documents while Clara moved toward the window. Below in the street, torches flickered a larger group than just Donovan and his deputies. "Mr. Hartwell, Miss Donovan, we know you're in there." Clara turned from the window. "Garrett's with them. And those two strangers. From yesterday." Samuel stuffed the documents inside his coat. "The window. Can we reach the roof?" Before Clara could answer, something heavy crashed against the door. The wood splintered around the lock. "Go," Samuel said, pushing Clara toward the window. "Get these documents out of town. Wire the governor from Colorado Springs. I'm not leaving you. Someone has to tell the story if they stop us here." Samuel pressed the papers into her hands. "Those families are counting on this evidence." The door burst open. Sheriff Donovan stepped through, gun drawn, followed by Garrett and two hard-faced men Samuel didn't recognize. "Miss Donovan," Garrett said smoothly, "your father's been looking for you." Clara had one leg over the windowsill, but now she stopped, seeing the gun barrels pointed at Samuel. "Let him go," she said. "This was my idea." Garrett smiled coldly. "I'm sure it was. Young ladies sometimes get romantic notions about justice and fairness. Fortunately, those notions can be corrected." Samuel took a step forward, drawing attention away from Clara. "You can't stop everyone from knowing the truth. Too many people have already seen the evidence." "What evidence?" Garrett gestured around the room. "I see a drifter and a banker's daughter meeting secretly in a hotel room. Scandalous, perhaps, but hardly criminal." One of the strangers moved closer to the window, cutting off Clara's escape route. Samuel realized with growing dread that these men had come prepared for violence, not just arrests. "You made one mistake," Samuel said, still trying to buy time. "You assumed no one would fight back." Garrett's smile widened. "Oh, but they won't. You see, by tomorrow morning, the story will be quite simple. A tragic fire at the hotel, caused by an overturned lamp. Two bodies found in the wreckage, a drifter and a young woman who'd been meeting him secretly. Very sad, very romantic, very final." Samuel met Clara's eyes across the room, seeing his own desperation reflected there. The documents inside his coat felt heavy as stones, the weight of evidence that would die with them if they didn't find a way out. The church bell chimed midnight, its bronze voice carrying across the valley like a funeral toll. "Such a shame," Garrett continued, pulling out a match. "But progress requires sacrifice. The railroad will bring prosperity to this valley, even if a few people have to be removed to make way for it." The smell of coal oil thickened as one of the strangers sloshed liquid across the room, walls gleaming wet in the lamplight. Garrett's smile curved as he struck a match. Samuel calculated distances, angles, chances the window behind Clara, Donovan's gun hand, the spreading pool that would turn the room into an inferno. Then, from the night outside, came a sudden clamour. The church bell, hammered in a frantic rhythm no service had ever used. A heartbeat later, a bloom of fire lit the sky where Peter Kowalski's men had set torches ablaze atop the granary roof, the signal they had prepared in case things went wrong. Garrett cursed. Donovan's head jerked toward the window, torn between duty and the sound of revolt. That single hesitation was enough. Samuel lunged, knocking the coal oil can aside and driving his shoulder into the nearest gunman. The match skittered harmlessly across the floor. Clara slipped through the window onto the steep roof as gunfire erupted, wood splintering around Samuel. He rolled, struck hard, then scrambled after her, the night air burning cold on his face. On the roof, Clara was already moving toward the trellis. "The papers, do you have them?" she gasped. Samuel patted his coat. "Still here." They dropped into the alley as shouts rose in the street. The hotel's upper floor caught fire anyway. Garrett's men had overturned a lamp in the struggle, flames licking greedily upward. But Samuel and Clara slipped into the shadows, moving with the urgency of fugitives. In the town square, two groups of armed men now faced each other. Donovan and his deputies before the burning hotel, and Peter Kowalski with a dozen valley men answering the bell's call. Between them, Garrett stood taut with fury, watching his careful plan unravel. Samuel pulled Clara toward the church. Inside, by moonlight, they opened the hidden safe behind the pulpit. Clara placed the damning letters and contracts inside, then locked it fast. "Peter's riders will carry copies to Denver before dawn," she whispered. "Even if we fall, the truth won't." Samuel's nod was grim. "Then we've done our part." The valley woke to hoofbeats federal marshals riding in from the pass, their badges catching the early light. Word spread faster than smoke. Families filled the square as the lead marshal dismounted with papers in hand. These were not men chasing rumors. Overnight, Peter's courier had delivered copies of Wyndham's letters to the territorial governor. The marshals arrived, holding evidence, not questions. They went first to Garrett, stripping him of his weapon and clapping irons on his wrists. Sheriff Donovan and the hired guns followed, bound before the eyes of the town they had betrayed. Donovan did not resist, only muttered toward Clara as they led him past. "I gave you 48 hours. You made them count." Clara and Samuel stood near the church steps, soot-streaked but unbroken. When Marshal Crawford approached, his voice carried the weight of certainty. "We have your documents. The governor thanks you for safeguarding them. Now we'll see justice done in Denver." Samuel glanced at Clara. For the first time since the auction bell, the valley seemed to breathe again. "Tom left the land to me," he said slowly. "But he also left something else, a responsibility to the people in this valley." Clara smiled. "The town will need a new sheriff. Someone the people trust, and a new banker. Someone who understands that profit shouldn't come at the expense of neighbors." They walked back toward town together, passing the ruins of the hotel where they had nearly died. In the harsh light of morning, the blackened timbers looked less like a tragedy and more like the foundation for something new. At the bank, federal agents were cataloging evidence while families lined up outside, waiting to reclaim their deed papers. The Kowalski mill wheel had started turning again, its steady rhythm promising grain for winter and hope for spring. Samuel paused at the bank's entrance, where a federal notice proclaimed the building under government seizure. Soon, someone would have to reopen it, restore trust, rebuild the financial foundation that held communities together. "Partners?" Clara asked, echoing her words from the auction. "Partners," Samuel agreed, shaking her offered hand. The courthouse clock chimed 10 times, its bronze voice carrying across the valley like a promise of justice restored. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and watching, their peaks white with snow that would soon fill the streams and turn the mill wheels and water the crops of a valley where families could finally build their futures without fear. The yellowed postcard in Samuel's pocket, Tom's final message, had brought him home to find more than just land. He had found purpose, partnership, and a community worth fighting for. The auction that had seemed like an ending had become, instead, a beginning. As the morning sun climbed higher, Samuel Hartwell stood in the main street of Millfield, Colorado, watching families reclaim their dreams and knowing that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to build a better future. The war for justice had been won, not with guns or violence, but with evidence and courage, and the simple truth that some things home, family, community are worth any price. If something in this story touched you, linger with us. We'll handle the rest.